and honor the folks who managed to get here on time. On behalf of our board of directors, welcome to United Way of San Luis Obispo County's presentation of our third real cost measure report. This presentation is made possible by the many years of support from our donors, volunteers, and staff, and is being sponsored by our friends at Wacker Wealth Partners. Our sincere gratitude to everyone. My name is Rick London, and I'm CEO of our local United Way. And again, thank you for joining us today. First, I'd like to start out with a couple of quotes from the report, Struggling to Move Up, the Real Cost Measure in California 2021. Quote, anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor. James A. Baldwin, 1960. Quote, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. Archbishop Helder Camara, 1995. Quote, overcoming poverty is not a task of charity, it is an act of justice. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. Sometimes it falls on a generation to be great. You can be that great generation. Let your greatness blossom. Nelson Mandela, 2002. Today's Real Cost Measure Report presentation is one of the many benefits resulting from the efforts and leadership by our colleagues collaborating as United Ways of California. We are one of 29 locally autonomous members of the finest state association within the United Way Worldwide Network. Today, we plan to spend an hour or so presenting the real cost measure, including a Q&A session, followed by a brief plug for A Portrait of California, another recently released report that I happen to think is another very valuable thought tool. And then, time permitting, I'll lead us in a conversation on what it takes to meet basic needs in San Luis Obispo County. Now, I would like to introduce our presenters. Pete Monzo is President and CEO of United Ways of California, which improves health education and financial results for low-income children and families by enhancing and coordinating the community impact and advocacy work of California's United Ways. Previously, Pete was Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Advancement Project, a civil rights action tank that advances equity and expands opportunity for low-income and vulnerable people. He was Executive Director and General Counsel for the Center for Nonprofit Management, where he directed the expansion of the center's information training, consulting, technology, and search and compensation services to nonprofits, and directing attorney of community development programs for Public Counsel. Pete is a graduate of Boalt Hall School of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. He also is a graduate of the London School of Economics, where he received a master's degree in political sociology, and the University of Notre Dame, where he received a bachelor's degree in government. Henry Gascon is Director of Program and Policy Development at United Ways of California. In this role, Henry In this role, Henry conducts policy research and analysis, leads communication strategies, and assists with organizational operations. Henry is also co-author of the Real Cost Measure in California, which introduces a new poverty measure and conveys the true cost of living in California's communities, and promotes the Human Development Index, which discusses well-being and health, education, and financial stability. Previously, Henry was a policy analyst at Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority and director of Empower Los Angeles, a social service organization that provided technology education services for Southern California nonprofit sector. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and international relations from Holy Names University in Oakland, California, and a master's in public administration specializing in policy analysis from the Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service at New York University. We're very fortunate to have Pete and Henry with us here today. And now it's my pleasure. Pete, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Rick. I just want to welcome everybody and turn it over really quickly to Henry so we can dive into the data. I think the one thing that we would probably want to say at the outset is that the reason we produced this study is precisely so we can have conversations like this one, where you get community level, neighborhood level information about the cost of living locally, what it looks like to afford a decent standard of living, and then how many families of what size and configuration in your community are struggling to afford that decent standard of living. The whole point of doing this is so that we can point the way to help people move up to be able to afford that decent standard of living. And that's why we produced the report. I'll stop there and turn it over to Henry. Henry?
Great. Thanks so much, Pete. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and do a share screen here so we can get started with today's presentation. So just bear with me as a second as we get this technology going. I'm going to maximize our screens, and here we go. Everybody should be able to see my screen just okay. So as Rick mentioned, we'd like to go ahead and thank also Wacker Wealth Partners for making this event possible and for the support of the Real Cost Measure over the past couple of years. And they're a great partner in San Luis Obispo. So just thank you for your support as well. And then for those of you who are on social media and want to promote the session, we have our hashtags and our tags here. So you can go ahead and post that Real Cost Measure at United Ways CA, or tag United Way of San Luis Obispo at UWSLOC. And also we are recording the session so for those of you who just want to review the material afterwards, we're going to go ahead and make that available to you in addition to the presentation slides. So I believe the wonderful team at United Way San Luis Obispo will be sending those materials following the session today. So before we actually get started with the bulk of the presentation, I'd like to do a little bit of an interactive session with you. So you're all here from San Luis Obispo or perhaps other neighboring coastal communities. And imagine your own neighborhood that you live in. Just give that neighborhood a little bit of thought. Imagine you're part of a family with 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child. In the chat box, go ahead and put in how much you would spend on housing a month, just on average. Think about your neighborhood that you live in, family of 4, 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-age child. How much would you spend monthly on housing? Go ahead and put that in the chat box, and let's take a look at some of our responses. Okay, I see 2,500 in San Luis Obispo, low 2,000 figures. Okay. Cost of living is high pretty much everywhere in California, and we see it here reflected in San Luis Obispo. Okay, let's move on to childcare. If you're a family of 4, how much would you spend monthly on childcare on average? Just do your best guesstimate. Family of 4 with 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child. What would that cost of childcare look like in your neighborhood? 1,000 for childcare, 1,500, 3,000, 1,200. So kids are fantastic, but we know the cost of childcare could be really expensive, and we even see up to 3,000 here. And in some cases, we've seen the cost of childcare exceed the cost of housing in some of our communities in California, particularly in the Central Valley. What about the cost of food? Family of 4, 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-age child. How much would you spend monthly on food? 800, 600. And we know food prices, of course, have gone up over the past 18 months with inflation as well. So we're seeing rising food costs in some of our communities. Food costs 1,500. Wow, it's quite a bit for a month. 1,000. Okay, and let's do childcare. How much would this family of 4, 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-age child spend on childcare in your neighborhood? 1,200.
Oh.
You see healthcare costs 1,500, 1,800. So really high costs that we're seeing here in San Luis Obispo County, 1,500. And lastly, let's do transportation. Family of 4, 2 adults. How much do you spend monthly on transportation? And this is a pretty open question. It could be 2 cars. You could be paying car payments on it. You could be addressing maintenance, gas, ongoing things with cars. 600 a month on cars. 1,800, 800. So we're seeing the cost of living come up quite exponentially here with this chat box. So thanks to all of you who have participated in this exercise. It gives us a really good sense just in terms of what you're seeing with the cost of living here in San Luis Obispo and in San Luis Obispo County. So I'm going to go ahead and just collapse the little chat box here where I can see the full screen. And here's some information about the real cost measure. It's a more accurate measure in terms of who is struggling in California. So for those of you who may be familiar with the official poverty measure, it was founded during the 1960s under the administration of Lyndon Johnson. And if you're going to declare a war on poverty, you need some sort of an instrument to measure it by. So very famously, Molly Orshansky, an official within his Social Security Administration, looked at the cost of food because that was one of the biggest expenses for many families during the 1950s and 60s. So in essence, that's actually what our official poverty measure is based by. It's based on the cost of food, adjusted for inflation, of course. So the official poverty measure does not take into account the cost of housing, childcare, transportation, healthcare, and some of the other basic needs that we just talked about in the chat box. And the official poverty measure also does not take into account geographical differences. So it treats poverty the same way as it does in California, as it does in Iowa and Mississippi and other parts of the country. So given that, it's important to go ahead and create a better measure of self-sufficiency, to actually look at the cost of living. And this is what the real cost measure does. All the things that we talked about in the chat box in terms of the cost of housing, food, healthcare, childcare, and other basic needs are incorporated in this real cost measure, which we have been developing in California over the past 6 or 7 years. And the focus of the real cost measure is on working households. So in doing so, we don't include households led by persons with disabilities, just because they're not working households and because they take up such a small percentage of the statewide population in terms of heads of households. And also we treat senior households differently. As part of our development with the real cost measure, we also partner with the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health on the Elder Index. And they just released a study last year, which looks at the cost of living among seniors. And one of the things that we learned as a result of that partnership is that seniors are more likely to skip out on their basic healthcare needs in order to catch up with the cost of food, housing, and other major expenses. So we're learning quite a bit just in terms of the financial security challenges facing many seniors as well, thanks to our partnership with UCLA. The real cost measure also takes into account geographical differences. So we're able to take a look at statewide data regional data, such as the San Francisco Bay Area, the Central Coast, and Southern California. We have data on most of our individual 58 counties throughout California. And thanks to our partnership with the US Census Bureau, we actually have neighborhood level data. And this is a publicly available data set called public use microdata areas. I just call them neighborhood clusters. And what the US Census Bureau does is that they consolidate neighborhoods that are right next to each other to get a sample size of at least 100,000 people to make it statistically significant. So we have that, and that having that layer of neighborhood level data is far more statistically accurate than zip codes or census tracts, where the numbers could certainly be very small and unreliable. And then lastly, our team actually developed household budgets for up to 20 adults in a household for all of the 58 counties in California. And that's ballpark, it's about 1,600 household budgets. So we're able to take a look at the cost of living by the family size in terms of if it's 2 adults and what the role of kids play in terms of a household family's expenses. And one of the things that we've learned over the years is that the age of children really makes a big difference in terms of a family's ability to make ends meet. So these are just, so we treat the real cost measure as not just a study that's just going to be released and put on a bookshelf. We treat the real cost measure as a shared living experience that many families go through each and every day. And in so doing so, and we'll do an on-hands demonstration of this later on, we have an interactive tool where you can put in all the age numbers of everybody in your family and identify the county that you live in, and it will tell you what the minimum that family needs to survive in California. And we have lots of interactive tools, interactive maps, an interactive dashboard. We have one-page county fact sheets and a public data set for those of you who want to wonk out on the data, Microsoft Excel. All of these data and resources are available on our website at unitedwaysca.org/realcost. So I'm not going to wonk out too much on all the data sources that we use to comprise the real cost measure. But one thing I do want to emphasize is that we use publicly available government data to calculate the cost of living in California. And in doing so, we establish what's the minimum standard a family has to earn, not the average, but the minimum. So in doing so, we look at data points such as fair market rent rates by HUD. They're often used to determine the price for Section 8 housing throughout the United States. We also looked at the low-cost food plan offered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And for county level data, we often look at the Consumer Expenditure Survey to look at what expenses look like in any given county. So this is where the geographical differences really apply. And then taxes, we've actually gotten really good in terms of calculating this, where we're not only able to incorporate federal, state, and local taxes, but are incorporating the increasingly important role of childcare and childcare tax credits into a family's ability to make ends meet. And we know, of course, during the pandemic, many families have been very reliant on these childcare tax credits in order to help families get through the pandemic. So let's take a look at this little kind of what we call our little waterfall. And let's stick to the same family configuration of 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child, and looking at the lens of San Luis Obispo. The first thing that we see here on this chart is that it would take this family of 4 about over $86,000 to make ends meet in San Luis Obispo County. So let's take a look at the average income of a family of 4 below the real cost measure. And we can actually just see, just on average, it's about $49,000 in wages, about $570 in interest and other sources of income, $107 for CalWorks, which is California's version for the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, and about almost over $1,900 in the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs that we have here in the United States. So if this family of 4 was to take advantage of all the income and the public benefits available to them, it would look like about over $63,000 in income. But notice the gap that family still faces in order to reach the real cost measure. In many cases, many of these families could face a $23,000 gap to make ends meet. So what do they do? That's a real question for us. And the answer for that is that it really varies from family to family. Some families might decide to negotiate with their landlord to see if they can pay half of next month's rent now and catch up with the rest later. Some might actually just pass on childcare for the next month and have their child siblings take care of them when they're at home. And some might simply just cut down on food costs. How the family really varies looks very different from one case to the next. And there was a great book that was published a few years ago called The Financial Diaries by Jonathan Murdoch and Rachel Snyder. And they interviewed many hundreds of low-income families throughout the country. And one of the things that they realized is that many of the families who were struggling had inconsistent income throughout the calendar year. So for those workers who are in retail, for example, they would usually realize their peak hours during the holiday season when they're asked to come into work extra shifts, and then by the time January comes along, those holiday hours are no longer needed, so they're asked to cut down on those costs. And then they would often go through this ebb and flow of income throughout the entire calendar year, especially if you're in retail or in the manufacturing sectors. So inconsistent income is a real story for families who are struggling below the real cost measure. So let's take a look at the cost of living using the same family size of 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-age child, and see how it compares with other parts of California. So we saw earlier in San Luis Obispo, it's about $86,000, and we see that the cost of living is much more expensive in other parts of the state, such as Los Angeles, Orange, and Contra Costa County. Contra Costa County, of course, is a bit of an outlier because it's not only one of the wealthiest areas in California and the United States, but it's also, in doing so, one of the most expensive to live there. So look at the cost of housing. The minimum cost of housing there for this family of 4 will probably be around $32,000, and the average cost of childcare is over $21,000. Compare that to San Luis Obispo, where you can actually just see the cost of healthcare is pretty consistent at $9,400. Transportation cost is at $11,000, and you can actually just see the cost of living there by color and by household need. And you can actually just see how the geographical differences really comes into effect depending on where you live in California in terms of your ability to make ends meet. So we mentioned before how the presence of children can certainly make a big impact on a family's ability to make ends meet. And this chart here reflects that. So on the first bar chart here, we have 2 adults. In the second bar chart, we have 2 adults, a preschooler and a school-age child. And in the last column, we have 2 adults, a school-age child, and a teenager. So notice the height of the family's ability to make ends meet is really in the second column, where a preschooler and a school-age child are largely contingent upon childcare. And you can just see that incredibly high childcare costs here in San Luis Obispo County, assuming, of course, that this family is using a licensed childcare provider, where the average cost here is about $17,000. However, when these kids grow up a little bit, once that preschool and school-age child become a school-age child and teenager respectively, notice how the cost of childcare reduces and the cost of transportation and the cost of food actually increases. So teenagers tend to be a little bit hungrier. They tend to hoard the refrigerator a little bit more, and you can actually just see how those food prices are reflected here in this household budget. So it goes from $86,300 with a family of 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and a school-age child, to about $74,000 if you have 2 adults, a school-age child, and 1 teenager here in San Luis Obispo County. So here's the real finding with the real cost measure. So we talked about the deficiencies with the official poverty measure earlier, and we usually find the official poverty measure usually hovers between 12 and 14% in any given community throughout California, but we're finding up to 33% of families are falling below the real cost measure when you take into account the cost of housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and other basic needs that you need to make ends meet in California. And when we quantify that, that's over 3.5 million households throughout the states. And we all know and experience every day a family that's experiencing in their degree of struggle. And another big factor of this is that we find that up to 97% of households below the real cost measure have at least one working adult. And it's really high throughout the entire state. So the point that we made earlier is that a lot of these households are working hard. They're working multiple jobs in various hours. And how that looks like varies from family to family. But these aren't families that aren't looking to take advantage of the public benefit system that's available to us. They're working hard in their ability to make ends meet. So here's a chart of the historical real cost measure analysis, since we've been doing this since 2014, 2015. And you can actually see over the past few years, households are actually doing a little bit better over time in terms of a family's ability to make ends meet. So this is just looking at San Luis Obispo County, the peak where we started doing this analysis. Up to 33% of families are struggling to make ends meet in San Luis Obispo in 2014. Now it's about 26% in 2019. So notice how our data only goes through 2019. And the reality is it's a completely different world in 2019 as it is now with the realities of the pandemic. It's a little bit too early for us to start looking at pandemic data and the ability to make ends meet. I think it's probably going to take a couple of more years to do that, just because we're primarily still living through this experience. But we could certainly expect some variations in terms of the cost of living among many families over the next couple of years. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So here's a map of California using the previously mentioned public use microdata areas, and I just call them neighborhood clusters, and they just get a sample size of at least 100,000 people to make it statistically reliable. And you can actually just see California has 265 of these neighborhood clusters, easily the most in the nation. But you can actually see the big discrepancies in terms of what it takes to make ends meet in California. And here are the two biggest communities in terms of disparities. Only 11% of families in the community of San Ramon and Danville in the heart of Contra Costa County are struggling to make ends meet, compared to 80% of families in the community of East Vernon, right in the heart of South Los Angeles, are struggling to make ends meet. So you see the darker areas here indicate a higher degree of struggle. The darkest range here, the dark brown areas, up to 60 to 80% of families are struggling, whereas in the light yellow areas, only 11 to 22% of families are struggling in California. Here's what it looks like on a county basis throughout Central Coast. And for Karen, and for those of you who are just joining on, if you can put yourselves on mute, that would be great. So we see up to 30% of families in Santa Cruz County are struggling to make ends meet, 36% in Monterey and San Luis Obispo, 36% in Santa Barbara, and 26% in Ventura County. So the cost of living really depends upon family size and where you live throughout California. And in San Luis Obispo, the US Census Bureau has identified two neighborhood clusters. They very simply call it the coastal region and the inland region, but you can actually just see on the west coast of San Luis Obispo County, the coastal region, 15% of families are struggling compared to about 11% in the inland region. So big differences there. So we also take a look at the intersection between race and the real cost measure as well. And the biggest finding that we have is that 52% of households led by Latinos are struggling to make ends meet in California. And when we quantify that, that's 1.7 million households. We don't have a lot of good data on race, unfortunately, in San Luis Obispo, but due to small sample sizes, but we do have some really good data on California. So you can actually just see how this chart really kind of complements a lot of the other social science research out there that says Latino and African-American households are struggling the most throughout California. This, of course, is the rate of struggle within each of these ethnic groups. So you can actually just see in California, 28% of Asian American households are struggling. And one of the new data sets that we're starting to look at are Native American households, where 39% of households led by Native Americans are struggling throughout the state. And even 21% of white households are struggling throughout the states. So this is the percentage of struggle within each of these racial groups, but I want to go ahead and twist these numbers around to tell a different story. If we focus on the quantity of the degree of struggle, we can actually just see Latino households continue to struggle the most. They're also the largest population in California, where we find 1.7 million fall below the real cost measure. But notice the second highest group struggling throughout the state in terms of volume. It's white households. So this actually helps to present just kind of another picture in terms of the degree of struggle throughout the entire states. We also take a look at the intersection between educational attainment and the real cost measure. And we've known for years, the more educational attainment that you have, the less likely you are to struggle. And our research with the real cost measure certainly complements that, where we find up to almost 70% of households led without a person without a high school diploma are struggling, compared to about 16%. I think if we did the real cost measure back during the 1950s, 60s, when labor protections were stronger, when there was a stronger prevalence of unions, we would probably see households led by a person without a high school diploma to be struggling less. We don't know what those numbers would be. They would speculate less, but we can actually just see how unions have declined over the years, how the degree of educational attainment is becoming far more important. And even now, we're having lots of good arguments throughout our society in terms of, do you need a master's degree now in terms of your ability to make ends meet? And the jury is still kind of out on that, but the data tells us that 16% of households with at least a bachelor's degree are struggling throughout the entire states. We also have great data in terms of citizenship status. So we have data on US born citizens, naturalized US citizens, those who are green card holders, and those who are on the path to citizenship. And you can actually just see that up to 60% of non-citizens are struggling in California. And one of the things that we've learned through this research, and this is still ongoing as well, is that the ability to speak English goes a long way in terms of your ability to make ends meet. And for many families who just speak Spanish or many Asia or other Asian languages or what have you throughout the entire state, many of them often rely upon the children in terms of finding access to services or after school programs that might benefit them. So in many cases, those children are forced to kind of grow up more quickly and become kind of a head of household in terms of navigating through all the different portal of resources that a family has access to. So we're learning quite a bit about some of the challenges that non-English speakers are having throughout the state as well. We also look critically at the role of women, and we find that 50% of households led by women throughout California are falling below the real cost measure. And how this looks like, it could be single moms, it could be grandparents who are taking care of children. As long as that head of household is considered a woman, this is what we're kind of looking at. And the estimated data that we have is up to over 772,000 households led by women are falling below the real cost measure. And if we go into a little bit about the weeds here in terms of conjugal status or gender-headed status, and we see 28% of married households fall below the real cost measure. You can actually just see how big of an outlier women households are. But even 44% of single dads or single grandparents or other foster families led by male figures are struggling throughout the state. That's at 44%. And then we also take a look at what we call informal households. Those are households that are just doubling up. They're unrelated but cohabitating. So we've heard of many stories, for example, of teachers in the San Francisco Bay Area and in other parts of the states who are doubling up on housing, putting in their resources together to make sure that they have a roof over their heads and are able to meet basic needs because their own salary isn't able to cover the cost of living. So it really depends on family to family again, and what kind of industry that you're working in. I mentioned single mothers earlier. We find that over 7 in 10 single mothers in California, about 71%, are falling below the real cost measure. And when we quantify that, that's almost 575,000 households. And of course, we know the sacrifices that single mothers make every single day. They're not only the breadwinner for their entire household, but they're also the entire emotional support system as well. So because single moms often work different hours throughout the entire day and have probably very likely inconsistent income, they often rely on their siblings or friends and neighbors to take care of their children, because the single mom isn't always there to make sure that their kids are able to go to school in the morning, are able to do their homework in the afternoon or are tucked in at night. So often single moms have to rely on other people, other family assets, and neighbors' assets in order to help a family in their ability to make ends meet. And another very vulnerable population throughout the entire state are households led by with young children, primarily the ages of 0 and 5. And we find that over 54% of families with children within that age group fall below the real cost measure. And when we quantify that, that's over 913,000 families. So that's quite significant. And it tells us quite a bit in terms of the cost of childcare and how expensive that has been in California, in some cases exceeding the cost of housing, as we discussed earlier. So quite easily, I think the two biggest barriers that compromise, that affect a family's ability to make ends meet in California are the cost of housing and the cost of childcare. So, you know, for many years, we've been told that we shouldn't be spending more than 30% of our income on housing, especially growing up during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the reality is, with the high cost of housing everywhere throughout the state, and frankly, increasingly throughout the rest of the country, we find that up to 38% of families in California are spending at least 38% of their income on housing. So it's an open question in terms of, should we actually be looking at 40% now as the kind of housing burden barometer? So this is what it looks like in San Luis Obispo County. There's over 32,000 households, nearly 33,000 households that spend at least 33% of their income on housing. And here's what it looks like in California when we take a look at the use of neighborhood clusters. The dark red areas indicate more families, a higher percentage of families are paying more of their income on housing. The lighter areas indicate less so. And here are the two extremes. Up to 61% of families in the community of East Vernon pay at least 30% of their income on housing, compared to about 22% in the community of the Mission District in San Francisco County. But you can actually just see all over the place, particularly in coastal communities, how so many families are spending so much of their income on housing. And the farther a family below the real cost measure is, so let's say if they're about 80%, so the deeper a family is below the real cost measure, some of these families could easily be paying up to 80% of their income on housing, depending on who they are and where they live. And here it is in terms of the two neighborhood clusters in San Luis Obispo County, where we find 41% of households in the coastal region, the left part of San Luis Obispo County, pay at least 30% of their income on housing, compared to about 35% in the inland region on the east side. And lastly, let's take a look at the picture with median household income. And we know that California is an incredibly high, expensive state to live in, but we also have many people, many individuals, many households who have strong degree of affluence. And that is particularly reflected in Silicon Valley, where we find such high concentrated areas of income. The average household, for example, in the community of Cupertino, Saratoga and Los Gatos, their median earnings is over $220,000, compared to about $47,000 in the community of Bakersfield City, the southeast portion of Kern County. And you can actually just see how the degree of income really varies throughout the entire states. And the income is actually pretty close in the two neighborhood clusters that we see here in San Luis Obispo County, where it's about almost 87,000 in the inland region, the eastern part of the county, compared to about 81,000 in the coastal region. So just to put a big picture context on this, and Pete can speak to this more in a couple of minutes, but since 1984, California's gross domestic product, of course, is the value of all goods and services produced in the state, has increased by 155%. Whereas median household earnings has only increased by 11% during that same time frame. And you can actually just see the big disparities between the blue and the red parts of this chart. And I think if we were to take this chart back and do a little bit more of a longitudinal analysis, maybe going back to the mid 70s or late 70s, I don't think this chart would look very different. And what this chart essentially tells us is that the cost of goods and services continues to increase, but the middle class hasn't gotten a raise in over 4 decades. And this chart really kind of reflects that in terms of what's going on. And I think the national picture actually represents a similar story as well. And speaking of that national picture, here, let's say if we want to take a more longitudinal perspective, since the end of World War II, let's go back to 1948. And if we take a look at some great data by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in terms of comparing hourly compensation and net productivity, you can see our net productivity has been absolutely off the roof. Our GDP is, of course, the highest of any nation in the world. Our productivity has increased 260% since the end of World War II. But notice how our hourly compensation, the work that we get rewarded as a result of that labor, has pretty much flattened out since the early 1970s. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Pete to talk about the advocacy levers. Pete, over to you.
Thanks, Henry. Okay, so you'll have to advance. I didn't realize these slides have animation.
Sure.
You can just advance them and I'll cover real quickly.
Oops. Thanks.
Yeah, let's stick with that first slide. So, the point of doing this whole study is to do something about it, right? It's to try and either support families and help them move up, or make system change that makes it more likely that more households can achieve a decent standard of living. So it's unrealistic to expect people to just do it on their own, for families to do it through their own heroic effort. They're somehow going to just lift themselves up by their bootstraps. We all have a responsibility, we think, to do what we can to try and change the system to help them. Another reason that we do this report is so that we can kind of chunk the problem. When you get federal poverty statistics, it just tells you X number of households or families earn Y dollars, tells you how little their income is. It doesn't tell you much about, where they live, or how many of them have young children or led by single mothers. It doesn't help you kind of chunk the problem and see what the specific needs of different families are. So that's kind of why we wanted to present this data. The top line over everything is, overwhelmingly, these households that struggle to meet a decent standard of living are already working, right? So the standard response for a lot of people is get a job. Well, the point is they already have jobs, right? And many of these households have one or two working adults in them already. So the issue is we need to help them earn more, not just acquire work, right? So what can we do? And these are ranked in terms of things that are kind of easier. We know what the problem is and we know how to solve it, and then to more difficult problems. So we'll start with the easier ones first. Preserve and expand health coverage. We have that in California with the Affordable Care Act and other things that the state has done. Just about everybody who's low income, including undocumented folks, now has access to health coverage. So make sure that they're covered. Maximize tax credits and food assistance and other income supports. Again, these are working families, right? So let's maximize income supports that go to them. Every year, roughly, California leaves around $4 to $5 billion on the table. Those are unclaimed tax credits, unclaimed CalFresh assistance to help these low income working families. Childcare, as Henry showed in many areas, households with young children, childcare is a very big expense for them. And so let's do what we can to expand childcare that's free or low cost. And then let's level up post-secondary education. When you look at the education figures, you see that as people's educational attainment goes up, their rate of struggling goes down. And the good news about the data is a lot of people are within striking distance of getting their GED, or they're a year away from their AA, or they started a BA and they didn't finish. It's not that far, right? We can help people level up in terms of education, and that'll help everyone. Let's go next slide, please, Henry. All right, so we also want to help these families preserve what they have. We want to protect their assets and their income from predatory financial practices. So let's do what we can to reduce their need to resort to payday lenders to make ends meet. Henry talked about volatility of income, right? These workers often have hours that fluctuate over the course of a month. One week it's 20 hours, the next week it's 40, the next week it might be 30, and that makes it difficult for them. Let's explore ways to help smooth out those gaps and those variations without having to resort to payday lending, for example, when you get trapped in a cycle of debt. As Henry showed, a lot of households that struggle are led by immigrants, right? And it's particularly immigrants that don't have a family member 14 or older that speaks English well. They struggle more. And also we see is that when we naturalize immigrants, when they become citizens, their rate of struggle overall, pretty quickly achieves, the same level of rate as naturalized families, folks born here, right? So let's integrate and naturalize immigrants is something that we can do. Housing, I told you we were going from difficult to, from easy to difficult. So these are getting more difficult now. Housing is a big problem in California, and we've got to do something to increase our support for renters, because most of these households that are struggling to afford a decent standard of living are overwhelmingly, they're renters, right? They're not homeowners necessarily. We need to expand the availability of units. We also need to do something to subsidize or support renters. Nationally, we spend about $3 supporting homeowners, and homeowners are more across the board higher income. For every $1 that we spend supporting renters in this country, we need to balance that out. Make work pay. And so in California, we've been increasing the minimum wage every year. That's really good. We need to do more of that and do things to reduce things like wage theft. But we also find that a lot of people are in what we call contingent work, right? So those are not just your Uber and your Lyft drivers, but people have 2 or 3 employers, and their hours can fluctuate between them. They don't have a steady set amount of income that's coming in. And then we need to adapt to the changing nature of work. With the automation, right, and artificial intelligence, many more jobs are going to become at risk of being lost or automated away, right? And this is going to move up the value chain. So people who are accountants and lawyers and other folks are going to find increasingly those jobs are going to be done by machines, right? So we need to adapt to those things, right? Our entire social safety net and our assumptions around health insurance and food assistance and everything was under the old notion that people would have one employer, right, that employed them full time. And back in the old days, it would be for years, for decades, right? That's not the way it is today. Nowadays, people change employers much more often. They have 2 or 3 employers. None of them are, they're full-time employers. And so we need to change our rules and our support systems to accommodate that. If we want people to have healthcare, to be able to save for retirement, right? To be able to own a home. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Pete. And we're going to turn it over to Rick for a broader conversation. But before we do that, I just want to go ahead and just do a very brief overview in terms of the interactive resources that we have available with the real cost measure. So it's not just a tool that we have here on our website or a written executive summary. This is a shared living experience that many families struggle with each and every day. So we have one of the first things that I actually want to show is our household budgets calculator. So you can actually go ahead and go into our website, and we'll show the resources a bit later. You go select San Luis Obispo here from the drop-down menu. You can put in the age members of various persons in your households. Let's say if I have 2 adults at the age of 44, let me add a senior onto that. Let me add a teenager with the age of 15, and perhaps a school-age child at the age of 8. So this family of 5 on average would have to earn almost $93,000 annually, or about $7,700 monthly to make ends meet. So this is really dependent upon where you live and the number of age the number of persons and the ages of their household as well. We also have this wonderful interactive dashboard where we can actually go ahead and take a look at that waterfall chart that I showed at the very beginning of this presentation. We have interactive maps, and then we actually have our real cost measure budgets by county. So you can actually go ahead and just choose some standard family sizes, for example, and you can see how the cost of living really varies between different parts of the state. So if I just choose Central Coast, and if I just choose the default 2 adults, 1 preschool, and 1 school age child, you can actually just see what the cost of living looks like between Monterey and San Bernardino counties and Santa Barbara County as well. And then lastly, we have this wonderful one-page county profiles as well. So you can actually download them both by region, by the Central Coast. And if you scroll down a little bit, you can actually just choose them by county, and you can actually just select San Luis Obispo County here, and you'll find just a one-page handout in terms of the primary resources with the real cost measure as well. One thing that we did over just the past couple of months is introduce legislative profiles. So for those of you who are in regular contact with statewide legislators, for example, or even congressional members, we actually have the maps of the congressional districts, state Senate districts, and the state assembly districts, where you can actually go ahead and look at a map of which, in terms of what the real cost measure looks like in any political jurisdiction. So if you want to have a conversation with the cost of living with an elected, you can actually have the ability to do so as well. So with that, I'm just going to pause here. I think we've spoken enough at you, and we want to have a conversation with you. So Rick, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over back to you.
Thanks, Henry. And thanks, Pete. Quite a bit of information, and really presented it in a way that I've been aware of this report for quite some time, and I think it highlights somewhat of the conundrum we exist in and gives us a real reality check about what we're dealing with. I was going to ask a couple questions, suggest a couple of questions, but I see Mr. Biles, you have your hand up? Go
Yes.
ahead, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Well, let me just say, I really, really appreciate and, very, very respectful of the work you've done here. And I'm an economist myself. I live in Morro Bay. I used to be head of the Oregon Small Business Development Center, which was kind of an economic development agency up there. I'm a native Californian, so I'd moved up there. I'd been in Silicon Valley for 20 years as a software economist there, looking at supply chain efficiency and productivity issues. But I've also done a lot of work with government, like your government data, input data, in-plan studies, economic impact studies, and occupational reconciliation between different cities, even within California, salary reconciliations between cities. So I'm familiar with using some of the data that, for example, Henry, you've been using, the community studies, the neighborhood clusters, and so on and so forth. My question is, have you, this is just really outstanding empirical analysis of the variation across just California that certainly could be applied across the nation. But I'm wondering if you've done this method, if you could, or just your thoughts about, because I know you haven't done it, so I'm not going to ask you specific questions, but in reverse, sort of looking at the top quintile of income producers, the top 1%, the people who are orders of magnitude more capable of hitting the cost of living in California. And what are the sociological characteristics of these groups? You mentioned, for example, in Los Altos, Silicon Valley, Cupertino, that's sort of, generally speaking, the most affluent area in California to cover the cost of living of California these days. I'm just wondering, though, if there's some general conclusions you could reach if you looked at the sociological characteristics of those very most top income groups. And that might play into even the advocacy levers that you're talking about in terms of, well, you mentioned, for example, protect assets from predatory financial practices. That's a very broad and general name for a lot of different practices that could be, regulated or, otherwise eliminated or somehow mitigated. So I'm just kind of wondering, how you might apply the same methodology looking at neighborhood clusters and different sociological groups. Who basically the question is, who's doing this to us? Who's inflation is a predatory game of the more organized versus the less organized. And so who are those groups? That was Max Weber and Charles Taylor have said that very point. So, who are these groups that are, and what's the nature? Is it inherited wealth? Is it quick bucks, IPOs in Silicon Valley, where the so-called entrepreneurs no longer have anything to do with now a valueless software product? It may have gone up to $160 a share. Now it's $1.60 a share, so on and so forth. Mergers and acquisitions. It seems like the financialization of the economy has produced that big gap that you spoke about between our productivity, which has risen, but we haven't been compensated for it, versus total value of GDP, which is, subject to inflation. So somewhere somebody's pulling out the money and they've got it. So the rest of us have to pay the prices and suffer the low wages. So, can you reverse your methodology and apply it to the top quintile of the income strata of society?
Yeah, that's 3 years of graduate school work, but I'll have Pete try to address that question.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. We probably should take a look at that. Like, what does the top 1% look like? I think that would be interesting. And we could do that. We have the data, right? In terms of, gender, race, educational attainment, and all that.
Yeah.
To explain the dynamics that got us here, Henry showed the chart about the divergence, right? Between our productivity and our wages. That was, there's a really good book. I mean, there are many, right? But one that we like, because somebody we know and who spoke at one of our conferences is called The End of Loyalty by Rick Wartzman he's at Claremont. And he documents, we used to have a consensus, right? In the coming out of World War II, and it started in the 30s as in response to labor strife, right? People said, okay, we want to try and make a deal here, right? There was an agreement between capital and labor and the community that, we would pay people a fair wage and we would pay attention to community needs and things would be kind of peaceful. We lost that consensus in the late 70s, early 80s, right?
Okay.
Roughly around the time when Ronald Reagan became president. And so that consensus doesn't hold anymore in this, right? Politically, culturally, we've seen the results of breaking that in some regards, right? And so, you're an economist, and we probably, to address some of this, we're going to need policy change and some of the changes around the rules. Now, the bright spots in California, we have increased the minimum wage. That's good. I think we're starting to see some of that, the benefits of that. The thing is, full-time minimum wage is $30,000. So if you have two full-time minimum wage earners in a household and they have two kids, 0 to 5, and they're living in SLO County, they're still going to be earning below a decent standard of living.
Right.
So minimum wage increase is good. Another bright spot is the state earned income tax credit, right? We created and expanded a state earned income tax credit that every year now drives $1 billion in support to those families earning below 30,000 again, right? But if you're in that $30,000 to $60,000 range, there's very little that we do for you, right? There's the federal earned income tax credit and the federal child tax credit, which are very beneficial. Those are great things. We can't control them at a state level. And by and large, what you see is that as families' income goes up, our supports for them, right? Subsidized healthcare, CalFresh, go down before they meet that self-sufficiency level. That's the squeeze that we need to work on policy-wise. I don't know if that begins to address your question.
Yeah, those are very specific answers. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, Pete.
Yeah, another question from Thomas Kirkland. I think we
Yes,
can.
there's a question in chat from Tom. Can you address that, Henry?
Yeah, thanks so much. So the real cost measure, takes into account, numerous basic needs, such as the cost of housing, childcare, transportation, and other things. But there's other things that it doesn't account for, such as utilities. And we're actually starting to have conversations with the California Public Utilities Commission in terms of possibly incorporating utilities in terms of the real cost measure and having them adopt it as well. But they've been great partners with us. But your questions in terms of household members with persons with disabilities, of course, there's added household expenses there. And in some cases, there is government support, and in many cases, there simply isn't. But that's an example just of an extra expense that isn't really accounted for with the real cost measure in terms of, if there's a person with disability, how are those costs really dealt with? But we have some really good data just in terms of just the basic needs level, but not those outlying factors. But that's a really great consideration for us to look at.
It is, if I could just jump in, it's a really important point. And our study excludes households led by people with disabilities. And the reason that we do that is, this whole field was kind of invented by Dr. Pierce Diana Pierce up at University of Washington, right? And she has taken a hard look at how to determine what a household budget is for households led by a person with a disability. And it's difficult because, there's so much variation. It's very hard to get a handle on hundreds of thousands of those families and say, this is a decent standard of living for the average person with a disability, because there's so much variation. But the point you're raising is it's much harder for those households even than what we've described here in our study.
And I think, if I remember correctly, I think we've calculated up to 2% of households in California are led by a person with disability. But I think Tom's question is taking into account, just a household member who is disabled and just the extra expenses that might be associated with that. So it's another big consideration that just really isn't factored with the real cost measure.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Tom, for that question. Tori actually chimed in unsolicited, but I'm wondering, soliciting a response to the question, what struck you most about the findings from the real cost measure presentation today, and did anything surprise you? I'm wondering if anybody in attendance would like to share their thoughts. Just unmute yourself. Raise your hand. Tori?
Not to dominate things, but one thing that I thought was interesting, you said that there were more neighborhood clusters in California than any other state in the nation, 265. I'm also interested in the fact that when you look at before, European civilization occurred to North America, there are more distinct tribal groups in California than the rest of North America, any arbitrary territory in North America. I'm just kind of interested in that fact.
Yeah. I mean, tribal groups are just really hard to measure just overall. And, The best data point that we can get is pretty much statewide data, where we find that 38% of households led by Native Americans are struggling as well. But the needs of Native American communities are certainly profound. We've also partnered with this great organization called Measure of America, who we also work with in the development of the California Human Development Index. And they measure well-being based upon life expectancy at birth, educational attainment, median personal earnings, and other characteristics. But one of the things that was really surprising in that study is how the life expectancy of Native Americans has actually decreased by 8 years over the past 8 or 10 years or so. So there's some very specific challenges facing Native American communities, not only in California, but throughout the country. And getting this data is actually really hard, and due to small sample sizes, but also just to the very unique challenges that these populations face every day.
Thank you.
Hi, Lauren, I see your hand. Nice to see you. Go ahead, please, Lauren, you're muted.
Oh, there we go. Good to see you, Rick. It's been a while. I wanted to just explore what we are doing with a brand new nonprofit that's just been created in the last 4 months. It's called Slow for Home. And we are anticipating helping to resettle numbers of Afghan refugees in the San Luis Obispo County area. And I am very much struck by the data that you gave for the county as the real cost calculator. And I'm thinking that we are going to share those particular graphs with our team as a basis for how much support do we realistically need to think about providing for each family. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Absolutely.
I think so.
And
Yeah, go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, and we want the data and the findings from the real cost measure to be disseminated as smallly and as broadly as possible. So even just on a family level, if you have a teenager, for example, and they come home after football practice or what have you, come in, raid the refrigerator, empties everything out, and everybody comes back at 6 o'clock in the evening, opens the refrigerator and is asking themselves, "Where's dinner?" This could be a general intervention opportunity to talk about the cost of living within your own household, and just talk about what food costs and what housing costs look like, and give kids an appreciation for the sacrifices that parents make each and every day. And then more broadly is what we're doing today here, having a community conversation with all of you to talk about the cost of living in terms of, what's working, what's not, in terms of helping families move up. And, we have interactive resources, we have an executive summary, we have the advocacy levers that Pete mentioned as well. We want to engage this as broadly as we can, and we're working really hard to get the word out. So thank you.
And are the slides that you presented today going to be available to us?
Yes, absolutely. We're going to share that and the recording for the session. And the great team at United Way San Luis Obispo will make it available shortly.
Very good. Thank you.
Lauren, thanks so much for sharing that. And I was going to ask a question, how do you plan to use these findings? And you jumped the gun there, so wonderful to see you again. Biz, I see your hand. Please go ahead. Thanks,
thank you, Rick, and thank you for having this presentation. I remember we had a beginning one at the Community Foundation a few years ago. I just wanted to bring up an issue as I watched the slides, and I look forward to having a copy. The needs of our Latino families in San Luis Obispo County, single mothers with children. The industries here, agriculture, hospitality, landscape, but agriculture, we serve huge numbers of families with children, young children who then grow. And it's like everything we do as we help them try to become citizens, everything takes forever. They need everything you and I need today, And they don't have, as Rick, when he's on the radio says, do you have $300 in your bank account for an emergency? And so in addition to welcoming, and I know Sally's here and she's on the committee with Lauren Brown, which is, I appreciate the new nonprofit. It's just, we have a lot of families here who also depend on our organizations. I've sort of looked through the group here, and we do have the OnDocuSupport group with an account at the Community Foundation right now, and a new half-time person, Abraham Melendez. So I'm just taking a minute or two here to bring you up to date that what we've done to help these immigrant families after COVID got started, when they were left out of the federal subsidy, we jumped into action, about 8-10 of us, and we're still going. So if anyone wants to assist in that arena, please just email me, esteinberg@capslo.org. Thank you, Henry and Peter. We're doing this at the national level tomorrow in my National Community Action Partnership Board meeting, going through Alice for the Nation. So thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Liz. Nice to see you and hear your comments. And Alice is another great report too, developed by United Ways. Sally, nice to see you. Please go ahead.
Hi, Rick. Nice to see you too. I gave Lauren Brown some MIT cost of living data for our county a while back. How does this differ? How does your data differ?
Ours is far more robust and it's more recent. So our data analysis goes through 2019, and we have historical analysis going back to 2014. But in addition to that, it just gives you, the MIT version just gives you, in terms of the numbers of struggling, we actually tell you who's struggling. We can actually go into by race, by citizenship status, by single mothers, by households with young children. And we actually calculate a far more robust degree of household budgets than the MIT version does.
Okay, thank you.
We should say a little bit more about that. You know, it's not that we're trying to show off or anything. It's just that when you're doing this, we started, for example, Alice does this, and they look at basically 8 family budgets, right, as a proxy for the whole world. And when we started to do that and we looked at California, we found that by using, say, 6 or 8 household budgets, we were missing a whole third of the population. We have a lot of multi-generational families out here. So then once you started pulling that thread, we ended up, and it's just, you know, with the computers the way they are, we ended up doing 1,100 rather than 8, so that we could get to like 98% of households in California.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks again, Sally. I saw Leola's hand up.
Hi.
Hi, Leola.
Hi, Henry and Pete. Thanks for stopping by today. I think Biz touched on this a little bit, and I'm neither surprised, or I'm not surprised, I should say. Mine is a question about actionable items, and specifically for folks who are engaged in advocacy work. And this report is good at being able to zero in and identify exactly where the barriers are, exactly what the problems are. What I'm curious about is, where do we as a community collectively begin to do the work of appealing for assistance, guidance, et cetera. And I know Clint's on the call, and Senator Laird is always engaged and committed to helping out our community, but where else? I know Biz mentioned this statewide meeting tomorrow.
So, well, what we're trying to do with the report and with the policy levers, which are suggestions, right, not prescriptions, is to identify, to start to chunk the problem, right? If we say, what are we going to do to help all struggling families in SLO County is one way. The other way to look at it is say, okay, who's struggling in SLO, right? Is it immigrant-led households? Is it households with young children, right? And then what you find, of course, everything's intersectional, right? And then so, if you do that analysis, you might end up saying, okay, what we're finding is there's an intersection between, immigrant-led families, right? With children 0 to 5 are, that's the bulk, or that's a big piece of our struggling population. And what are their specific needs, right? And then I wish there was an easy way, but the thing is every community is different, and we want to give you the tools to ask those questions and figure those intersections yourself, right? But that's where you may end up, for example. For my 2 cents at a statewide level, when I look at all of our data, we want to be the point Thomas made about people with disabilities, right? Or, seniors that are isolated. There are a lot of different folks we can worry about. Nationally, what you often hear is that children, 1 in 4 children in the state, in the country, are growing up in poverty. But actually in California, young children 0 to 5, over half of those households struggle, right? So, that's a sweet spot where you might look at 2-generation strategies. What can we do around childcare? What can we do around nutrition? What can we do around, and the childcare has the benefit of allowing the parents to either work more or go back to school, right? You start seeing areas where you get maybe more bang for the buck. I'll just stop there. I don't know if that begins to answer your question.
Thanks, Pete.
It did.
Thanks, Leo. Last, give the mic to Tori, and then Henry, I just wanted you to be prepared. I think it would be helpful to share a little bit about Portrait of California. I think it's important, while the folks are still here, to hear a little more deeper about the Human Development Index and that tool. Go ahead, Tori. Tori, you're still muted.
Sorry about that, folks. This is for Pete. And Pete, you had mentioned some specific advocacy levers in my last question, to answer my last questions and stuff. What about housing, and specifically, what would be some advocacy levers there? And in particular, regarding any predatory financial practices that could be eliminated there. One of the things that your study found is there's, not only is housing a very substantial cost of living component, but in California, there's a wide swath of the population that are renters, which means on the other side of the picture, there's a wide swath of households that are landlords and developers. And there's a lot of practices there. I mean, it's obviously a way to make money, to be a landlord and a developer, including various ways of leveraging borrowed money. One of the thoughts that I've had is that nonprofits that are helping low-income households deal with affordable housing, those nonprofits who often receive grants have to pay income taxes on those granted monies, and that if they did not have to pay income tax, that would give their ability to serve low income households a lot more leverage, make things more affordable at less cost, and so on and so forth. So just wondering, even in the area of housing, the way we tax and structure, the laws concerning nonprofits who help in providing affordable housing could be a venue for mitigating some of the predatory practices in, free market housing development and landlord practices.
Yeah, that's a huge topic area. We could spend a whole webinar just on housing.
Yeah.
I think the good news is, you know, I think nonprofits are actually able to get an income tax exemption. So if they're getting rental property, right, that's passive income and it shouldn't be taxed because of their nonprofit status. And they can also apply for, and most of them do, property tax exemptions. That varies county to county. Some counties don't give you as much, you know, that's not a statewide thing, right? Necessarily, you have to apply at each county level. I think in terms of scale, right? You know, we need, according to McKinsey, and this study is like 5 years old now, we need like 3.5 million more units of housing to begin to have enough units for everybody and have the price come down because we have enough units for everybody, right? You know, that if we spent 7 years building, you know, 500,000 units a year, which we've never done we've never done that before, it would take 7 years to get to that point, right? So we kind of have to pull every lever we can think of. There isn't one that I think would fix it. I do think we need to pay attention to renters. So the renters credit, which was in the chat, right? The Glazer bill, that increasing the renters credit would be good. You know, for-profit developers, they want to maximize their income, right? And so, you know, if there are new units coming online, either single-family homes, and there's a whole debate. There are a lot of people who say, build no more single-family homes. And that's actually not a crazy, from a policy or land use perspective, it's not a crazy point of view, but it's politically contentious, right? Because local control of land use decisions is like, it's a bedrock belief in the United States, right? Don't tell me how we can make our land use decisions from Sacramento or from DC. But if, you know, there are things that I think that we could be doing that I don't see us considering. In addition to the renter's credit, you know, the state could just buy homes. Sean Hannity's buying thousands of units of homes. We've got a surplus. Why aren't we buying homes, right? Or we could, with state and local government, we could share the appreciation with homeowners. We could be part owners of units that people could own, and then they could share some of the appreciation and then buy a new house. This is another way to help people get into home ownership, right? And then when the new buyer comes in, we subsidize that mortgage again, right? With the share that we owned. There are creative things that I think we could do at some scale. And I would encourage us, I mean, no one's in favor of public housing, because when we say public housing, you think about, you know, Cabrini Green in Chicago or something, but, you know, we could invest state assets in this common good, which is people being able to be sheltered.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Pete. Thanks, Tori, for that question. Pete, that the dialogue reminded me of the efforts United Ways of California put in supporting just a slight shift to Prop 13 and how the backlash with that, you know, it's just controversial trying to do pretty much anything when it comes to property rights and taxes.
Yeah, Prop 13's, you know how they say Cuba is a domestic policy issue rather than a foreign policy issue? Prop 13's more of a ideological issue rather than just straight economics, because actually, you know, it benefits a lot. There are a lot of for-profits that are not happy that their neighbors are not paying, you know, a current property rate, right? So it's interesting. The politics of that are interesting, but yeah, that's a whole another thing. But
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. I interject that as far as the complexity we're dealing with.
Yeah, just to give an example, like Facebook and Google are probably paying property tax rates on, like, say, 2007 properties that they bought. And Cisco down the block is probably paying a 1979 valuation, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, Santa Clara County and Facebook and Google are going, hey, is this really the way it should be? Are you the people that we wanted to benefit from this? I don't know, right?
Right.
Very good. Thank you. Henry, if you could give us a dip our toe in Portrait of California, I'd be grateful.
Sure, absolutely. And let me go ahead and just do a quick share screen because I actually have a slide on this as well. So bear with me as I navigate through this. So as I mentioned earlier, we partner with this great organization called Measure of America, who created the Human Development Index for the United States. And some of you might be familiar with the version produced by the United Nations every couple of years, where they rank all the countries in terms of well-being, looking at health, education, and income metrics, using international standards, usually data from the World Bank and a whole bunch of other resources. But Measure of America actually took a look at the US Census data and actually is able to measure things like life expectancy at birth, educational attainment, school enrollment, and median personal earnings. And then from that data, they create a very simple algorithm on a 0 to 10 scale in terms of where we rank in terms of human development. And the spirit behind that is that human development is a far more accurate measure in terms of who's struggling compared to the gross domestic product, which looks at the aggregate economy. So all of our United Ways throughout California are fully supportive of the new California Human Development Index report that Measure of America just released in November. And we're going to share, here's the link with you, but which we'll share off with you offline. But it's a great, wonderful study, which actually talks more in depth in terms of the opportunities and the challenges that many families and many people at the individual level are experiencing each and every day in terms of what are the barriers for helping them to achieve a healthy and productive life. And that information is at measureofamerica.org. So thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Henry. Does anybody have any other questions or comments? Otherwise, I think I'd like to really give a big hug to, I'm a hugger. I'd like to give a big hug to Henry and Pete. I've been experiencing this quite a few times, and every time I share time with the two of them, I learn something new. And I'm very grateful to having them in my life and leading the helm at United Ways of California. And I say hello to our board chair, Jeff Ham, who I just see, I'm just now seeing. Nice to see you, Jeff. And my appreciation to Linda Wingert, our Chief Operations Manager, and Leola Dublick McMillan, our Director of Resource and Equity Development. And I think I saw Riley Smith, who keeps us straight electronically, and 211, and Mohini Smith, who keeps our numbers in order. And I saw board member Tom Kirkland. I'm probably missing somebody else, and I'll probably regret having started to name a few people, but I'm just grateful to all of you. And I hope you found this session meaningful. We'll be sending out the slides, and the recording will be available. I think this is really worth sharing. From my perspective, this really brings to light the conundrum we face. We're really in a pickle the way we've evolved, that so many of us can't afford to live, and the majority of them are working hard. And how we straighten this out and find the the solutions, it's really going to take quite an effort to stay connected and to be kind and keep our words soft, tender, and sweet in case we have to eat them, and just try to really work this out. And that's what it takes to be a community. With that, let you have the rest of your time back, and please let us know if there's any other Email us with any thoughts or comments. You know how to get to us, unitedwaysolo.org. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.